So it is good to be with you once again, and we are continuing our journey through Scripture in canonical order, bouncing between Old and New Testament. And since we most recently studied the book of Numbers, we are jumping to the New Testament, and we are working on 1 Corinthians. So before I do what I usually do and ask what we already know, kind of get a baseline for our knowledge, I want to say that this will mark, when I am through, in May, this will be the 12th year worth of Bible study that I have prepared. And this was hands down the most challenging one to put together. There's just a lot going on and a lot of various strands that Paul weaves together here, and finding a place or a way to kind of grab onto them and present them to you in a way that kind of has some thematic coherence was an uphill battle. So I just want to say that, yes, I definitely learned a lot in preparing this, and I certainly hope that all of you are going to learn a lot as we go.
Well, we appreciate your efforts.
Well, thank you. And of course, in figuring out exactly how much we're going to learn, let's start with how much we already know. So 1 Corinthians, what do we know about 1 Corinthians?
Hear a lot of readings from it. Don't know anything about it, really.
There is a whole section of the lectionary where 1 Corinthians, it's week after week. That's the epistle reading. They kind of move through it more or less in order. We do not hear the whole letter, but we hear a pretty significant chunk of it.
It was written by Paul.
Yes.
54 AD from whatever city it was that he was in. He had formed this congregation earlier, several years earlier. And this is actually the second letter, because the first letter was lost. And he got a report that there's divisions in the Corinthian church. There is question about who they belong to, Paul or Apollos or Peter. And there was questions about sexual immorality, questions about eating food offered to idols, and questions about resurrection. So he wrote this letter and sent it on down.
So, yes, we are going to flesh out many of the points that Nick just made, including this idea that it is not actually the first letter from Paul to the Corinthian church. Paul is the founder of the church, and in his absence, some things have popped up that he hears about, that he says, hey, we got to talk about this. And then, he has a variety of topics he wants to address with them. And so all of that is true. All of that is true. I'm going to present some different ideas on the dating for the letter, but we're talking a difference of 3 or 4 years, not first century versus third century or anything like that.
The city I was trying to think of was Ephesus. He wrote it.
Ephesus, yes. And in addition to that, Nick, you mentioned Paul is the writer. This is one of the so-called undisputed letters of Paul. So of all the letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, there are 7 of them that on the whole, scholars agree, we don't have any question or doubt that these letters were written by Paul. Romans is one of them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, Philemon. I think those are the 7. You can Google it. Anyway, the point is, 1 Corinthians, no reputable scholar would say, we think this was somebody else who just put Paul's name on it to lend it greater authority. So we can say with a high degree of certainty that, this is the genuine article. anything else? Anything else we know about First Corinthians? Just to, again, just set the baseline, and all of these things we will dig into in far greater depth as we go. And if not, that's okay, because we are here to learn. So, as just by way of refreshment, as we learned when we studied Romans, ancient letters usually stuck pretty close to a standard form, and Paul does that as well. He tweaks it just a little bit, but the letter opens with an address to the recipients, followed with a greeting, and then there would be an opening thanksgiving, or if somebody other than Paul is writing it, kind of an opening talking about how much they love the person they're writing to, talking about how great the person they're writing to is. Paul gives thanks for the people he's writing to. And then there's a brief introduction that says, I'm writing this letter about fill in the blank. Then you have the main body of the text, so you have all the meat of the letter, and then it closes with some sort of exhortation. I hope that you will take action on some of the things I've talked about in the letter. Please make an effort to come visit me where we're at. So there's some sort of invitation to action. There is a greeting. So anybody who's not addressed right at the beginning of the letter, they might say, please give my best to all these other people in town. And then at the end, Paul ends with a word of grace or a benediction. And Paul thinks of these letters as a way to be with his people when he can't actually be there in person. So let's just go ahead and dive in right to our Bibles. Paul mentions this very thing in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 3. Nick, will you share that with us, please?
I'm opening this. For though absent in body, I'm present in spirit, and if spirit I have already pronounced judgment in the name of Lord Jesus Christ, the man who has done such a thing. When you are assembled and my spirit is present with the power of the Lord Jesus, you are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Did I read it right?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, those, no, that was good. But yeah, those verses 3 and 4 really are the focus that I wanted to have for the time being. We'll come back to handing people over to Satan. We'll get back to that. Though I am absent in body, I am present in spirit. So Paul is kind of saying, the things I'm saying in this letter, hear them like I am actually here talking to you. This letter is my presence with you when I can't actually be in the room. And again, it's just takes on, at least for me, a little bit of a different kind of relevance now in our world, where we have been spending significant time not being able to be with other people physically. So that idea that Paul is saying, you know, this is a way for me to overcome being physically separated from you by this letter. So in terms of being an ancient letter, it's again fairly standard form, which means it kind of tells us where we can look for certain parts of the letter. If we want to understand what is going on in this letter, it would behoove us to understand the place where he is sending the letter, as well as the place he is at in his career. And so we will go ahead, if there are not any questions at this point, we will go ahead and we will do just a brief overview of some of the important things that happened in Corinth.
Well, I have a feeling you're going to answer these questions, because I kept thinking, is the guy in prison? What part in his career he wrote this? Was it early on? Was it mid? Yeah, so I think it's coming.
We will. Yes, we will get there. Absolutely.
Okay.
So Corinth goes back a long way, but in terms of stuff that's important for understanding what it was like in Paul's time, we can jump to the year 146 BC. There was a group of Greek cities called the Achaean League, and it was kind of a federation of these little Greek city-states, and they allied together and they became allies with Rome. But the Achaean League kept expanding. They kept saying, well, we'll bring in some more Greek cities. We'll make ourselves a little bit bigger of a confederation. And the Romans were not real thrilled about having an increasingly powerful group somewhere where they wanted to expand. So the Romans defeated the Achaean League in 146, and because Corinth was the capital, they burned it to the ground. Anybody who was left alive, they sold into slavery just for good measure. So it was more or less uninhabited for about a century. And in 44 BC, Julius Caesar wanted to refound it as a Roman colony. And so if we think back to when we study Acts, the significance of the Roman colony is that it is often a settlement for retired civil servants, retired military people. So culturally, it's very Roman. It is populated with people who are very loyal to Rome, and Rome wanted to have these colonies at strategic places. So, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but that meant by the time Paul was there, Corinth was pretty culturally Roman. People were speaking Greek, not Latin, but it was pretty culturally Roman. And it was also populated by a lot of immigrants because it was a fairly new city. There were opportunities open for people because there was not really the old boy network established there yet. So people came from all over because it was kind of a place people could have a fresh start. That is why there were a lot of freedmen there, people who were formerly enslaved. These people had more opportunity in Corinth than they would have had in Rome or Ephesus or Athens or places like that. In fact, freedmen could even be elected to high office in Corinth. So you have people of all different backgrounds. It's a relatively new city. It's very cosmopolitan. By the middle of the first century, it has grown to be a place where some people, at least, are very wealthy. And the Greek geographer Strabo described the city like this. Corinth is called wealthy because of its commerce, since it is situated on the isthmus and is master of two harbors, of which the one leads straight to Asia and the other to Italy. It makes easy the exchange of merchandise from both countries that are so far distant from each other. It was a welcome alternative for the chance both of Italy and from Asia to land their cargoes here. And also the duties on what by land was exported from the Peloponnesus and what was imported to it fell to those who held the keys. And to later times, this ever remained so. So the other thing we remember about Paul is he is very strategic in where he goes. He wrote in Romans, I only go to places where nobody else has been there to preach the gospel yet so that they can hear it from me first. And that's part of what he puts in Romans. He says, in effect, that's how important Rome is. Even though I know there's already a church there, I'm still going to come see you. But Paul also likes to go to places that are along highways, and he likes to go to crossroads. So Corinth is a crossroads east-west of maritime commerce, and it is a crossroads north-south of commerce on land. So if you want to go somewhere and help an idea spread, Corinth is a good place to do that. So Paul sets up shop in Corinth. Let me stop there. Questions?
It is whatever happened to Corinth? Did it succumb to? Is it just ruins today, or is it still part of a? I don't really remember Corinth being mentioned as a major city in Greece today, so I'm assuming it's just ruins now.
I think it's still inhabited. I think it is a modern Greek city, but it does not have the importance that it did.
Maybe it's got a different name.
Well, according to Google Maps, it is still called Corinth, but
okay. All right.
But yeah, I'm not sure. It is not the crossroads of commerce that it once was. The trade routes have moved.
Yeah. It's not that far from Athens, so the way it looks on here.
Mhm.
All right. I was just curious.
Very good. So Corinth, you got a lot of people from all over the place, fairly open to new ideas, at least, as open to new ideas as the Romans could be. The religious landscape of the city. Downtown, there's remnants of a huge bronze statue of Athena and a temple to Apollo. So the downtown is dominated by Athena and Apollo. So we know that the worship of the traditional Greek gods was definitely alive and well at this time. But interestingly enough, the city was home to a lot of organizations called theosoi. And these are voluntary religious societies. People would choose to get together, to worship together, and to have fellowship. And these people oftentimes would become friends and they would take care of each other. One of the reasons these things were popular is that they were open to a much wider segment of the population than the temples were. I mean, anybody could go into a temple and pay for a sacrifice, but you had to be connected to be one of the temple priests. You had to be connected to be officially one of the folks who helped run it. Whereas these theosoi, it was more of a ground up kind of thing. People could come together, join this group of folks, and it really emphasized the importance of fellowship and relationship versus being in a particular place. So as I describe this, and the singular is theosos, is it ringing any bells for people? Does any of this sound at all like something we may be familiar with?
I was going to say, is that kind of what started what we now know as our churches?
I don't necessarily know that it started our churches, but it sure seems to, the idea of a church as a group of people probably was a little more familiar to the Corinthians than it would have been in a lot of other places. So this idea that you can get together with a group of people and worship, not necessarily at the temple. A lot of people in Corinth were familiar with that idea already. One scholar said that the many temples and places of worship, in addition to the theosoi, meant that Corinthian Christians would have been confronted on a daily basis by these imposing symbolic reminders of the religio-political world out of which they had been called. So remember, there is no concept of separation of church and state. Part of what goes on is you need to worship or at least pay proper respect to a variety of gods because these gods are the ones who help your country succeed in war. These gods are the ones who make the harvests come in. So if you are not worshiping these gods, that's a problem. So when you say, actually, there's only one God and we're just going to worship that God, you are kind of excluding yourself from a big part of what goes on in society. So when the scholar says they have been called out of this religio-political world, yeah, there's a lot of stuff these people are no longer welcome at once they become part of the church. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of the background in Corinth. Questions before we move on to kind of the background in terms of where Paul is at in his career and what he is doing?
What would the Jewish population be like, or is that almost non-existent in that part of the world?
So we know from the book of Acts that there is definitely a synagogue in Corinth. Any city of decent size is probably going to have a synagogue because the Jewish community was all over the Mediterranean. So yeah, there was definitely a Jewish community there, and we're going to turn to that very shortly. So for now, let me just say, yeah, we definitely know there was a synagogue there. That doesn't necessarily mean it was a huge population. I think they said traditionally the minimum number was you needed 10 adult men to start a synagogue, or maybe it was 12. I think it was 10. Sorry, ladies. It's just, I didn't make the rules. So yeah, but we know there was a Jewish population, and in fact, we even know who a couple of these people are and how they got there. So we'll turn to that next. But any other thoughts on Corinth? And for those playing the home game, if we remember from Greek architecture, there is such a thing as a Corinthian capital for a column, and a Corinthian capital has all the fancy leaves and stuff. They're the fanciest kind of top you can put on your columns. So there. So we kind of have to do a little bit of piecing together to figure out exactly the context of 1 Corinthians in terms of how it fits together in Paul's ministry. Thankfully for us, Luke provides us with a good amount of background, and he does it succinctly. So let us turn now to the book of Acts. And it's a little bit longer of a reading. We will break that up a little bit, but let me get there first. I'm trying to remember not to whistle, because I bet that would sound really bad coming through the microphone. All right. So, Renee, if you could give us 18, 1 through 4. Kim, if you could give us 5 through 11. And Carol, if you could give us 12 through 17.
I'm sorry, Pastor, I didn't get the chapter. I got 12 through 17.
Chapter 18.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And Renee, you'll need to unmute yourself.
After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, and a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, argued in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks.
When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night, the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
But when Gallio was proconsul of the Acacia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters. After he dismissed them from the tribunal, then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things.
So that in 17 verses is Luke's summary of Paul's ministry in Corinth. So if we go back and pick up a couple of pieces here, we know from other sources that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in the year 49. So we're assuming Paul likely arrived around the year 50 because Priscilla and Aquila are already there. And of course, when we looked at Romans, we kind of saw the fallout from that then Nero allowed the Jews to come back. And when they had left, the Jewish Christians had been in leadership. They came back. The Gentile Christians were in leadership, and there was conflict over, how do we figure this out? So we're thinking Paul is probably in Corinth around the year 50. Where does he go first when he arrives in Corinth?
Synagogue.
Exactly. Yeah. Verse 4, every Sabbath he would go to argue in the synagogue. And let's remember, of course, that in Judaism in this time, and to an extent in our own day, arguing about Torah is really important. This is something that really matters. It's a mark of respect. You don't argue with somebody who isn't worth your salt. That's why it's significant that Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees. The Pharisees at least go, this guy's worth having a conversation with. So Paul, in the same tradition, he goes and argues with the people. So he goes to the synagogue. Where does he go next?
Justus' house.
Yes, he goes to Titius Justus, who happens to live next door to the synagogue. Fantastic. And they say he is a worshiper of God. So that may indicate that he's part of this group of people that are touched on in the New Testament, where these people kind of live on the fringe of the synagogue. There are parts of Judaism that they find compelling, but they are not ready to convert to Judaism. So when Christianity comes along and says a lot of what God has done for Israel is actually for everyone, there was a pool of people right there who were really excited to hear that message. So, and again, this is the same thing he does everywhere he goes. He goes to the synagogue first when he's worn out his welcome there. Then he goes to the Gentiles. So he starts at this guy Justus's house. And what is the length of Paul's ministry in Corinth?
A year and a half.
He is there a year and a half, 18 months he is there. We also know, so if he gets there around the year 50, we also know that Gallio becomes proconsul likely in July of 51. We know it was in 51, and very often these appointments started in the middle of the year. So middle of 51, that's when Gallio shows up, and it seems to be not too long after Gallio gets there that Paul hightails us out of there and sails for Syria. So it seems that he is in Corinth between the years 50 and 51. More than likely, he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians while he is in Corinth. And probably, if I'm remembering right, he was back in Corinth again later when he wrote Romans. So we know that after Paul left, Apollos became the next leader of the church in Corinth. And that leads to some issues that Paul is trying to troubleshoot later. Tom, if you could share with us, please, 1 Corinthians 3:6, and I will share with us Acts 18:24 through 28.
I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth.
So Paul is talking about people that are saying, oh, I'm one of Paul's disciples. I'm one of Apollos's disciples. I like this leader. I like that leader. Oh, how come you can't be more like Pastor so-and-so? Some of the things Paul is talking about, same things happen today in the churches. So that is where we are at with that. In Acts, so this is right after Paul leaves, Acts 18:24. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the believers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. So Apollos is Paul's successor in Corinth, and he seems to be doing a bang-up job. Paul is a fan of his ministry, and Luke certainly is, from what we get here. So the church has been established for a little while, and what scholars think is going on with it is that sorry, lost my train of thought there for a moment. What they think was going on is that there were several house churches that might have been maybe 30 people, 30, 40 people, who would gather somewhat regularly, like these theosoi. They would get together for prayer, for fellowship, and then all of these house churches would gather together on the Lord's Day for worship that would include Holy Communion. And some of the things that Paul addresses in here, that there are groups and factions within there, may have had something to do with these different groups within the church, within the whole church in Corinth, coming together. And so people might say, well, we're the people who meet at Nick's house, and we really like the way Nick prays. When we get together and Kim does the prayers, that just doesn't cut it for us. And then Carol's crew comes in and says, well, we always have a really good spread for communion, but when Tom gets ready for communion, what gives? It's just like some bread and wine, So part of what is going on in Corinth is possibly you have little subgroups developing, and when they get together, they can't quite come all the way together. There's certainly other stuff going on that Paul comes out and names explicitly, but we think that's part of what's going on with the factionalism that is running rampant in Corinth. So that is what we can kind of piece together about Paul's ministry in Corinth. Now, 1 Corinthians comes from a period after this. We're not exactly sure how long, and I think what Nick said earlier, maybe the year 54, 55 is probably as good as any guess, and I'm sure there are reasons which I have not come across right at the moment why people have settled on that time frame. But let's turn to what is going on actually when he sits down and says, I have to write a pretty long letter to these crazy people. Let me stop there. Questions? Fantastic. As I say somewhat often, I will take no questions as a sign that I'm just explaining everything in such profound, such a profound way that further questions are not needed. So,
Well, I'll just make a comment though. It seems quite surprising that the church at Corinth was so small. I mean, it's when you add, it says they were no larger than 30 to 50 people, several houses, but I mean, several could mean what, 5 or 6? I mean, you're talking, multiply that out. The church at Corinth was, say, no bigger than probably was smaller than Holy Shepherd,
possibly,
to put it in context.
it could have been, 10 or a dozen, but yeah, it's not necessarily a massively large group of people, but they get a lot of press in the Bible because it's a congregation that Paul founded. So he feels responsible for them. And whatever it was that Paul said in this letter, people in the early church began to circulate it to each other. And that was important. So yeah, these early churches were not necessarily gigantic, but again, they were located at strategic places. And maybe, honestly, maybe the most important for us, we actually still have copies of his correspondence. Maybe the church in Athens was bigger. Maybe the church in Alexandria was bigger, but we don't have any writings to that church or about that church. So
More gathered.
exactly. And it's kind of a I see a parallel here with another ancient Greek author, Thucydides, who said thousands of years from now, people are going to think Athens was way bigger and better than it really was, because the Athenians like to build, and people will see these monuments and go, wow, the Athenians must have been great. And people will think that the Spartans, really weren't worth anything, because the Spartans didn't really bother building. They spent all their time getting ready to fight. Whereas, of course, Sparta did defeat Athens in the war. So some of it may just have to do with, the church in Corinth may not necessarily have been huge, but the record they have left to history becomes really important. So at a certain point, Paul decides, I got to write these people a letter. What makes him decide he has to write to these people? Let's go ahead and find out. Nick, will you share with us, please, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 and 11? Renee, if you can share with us 1 Corinthians 7:1. And Kim, if you could share with us 1 Corinthians 11:18.
Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement, that there be no divisions among you, but you be united in the same mind and same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters.
Okay, we'll come back and pick up the pieces in a minute here. All right, Renee, if you can unmute yourself and favor us with chapter 7 there.
Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman.
Okay, and out of chapter 11, what do we see there?
For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it.
So chapter 1, he says, I got this report from Chloe's people that there are divisions among you. You people are fighting each other. Chapter 7, well, you wrote me this in a letter before. I want to talk about it a little bit. So we know there's correspondence going back and forth. And in chapter 11, I hear that there are divisions, and to some extent I believe it. So he is getting reports that things are not going well in Corinth. To paraphrase Shakespeare, something stinks in Corinth. So Paul is getting these reports, and again, as the founder of the church, he feels responsible for helping these people kind of get it back on the rails. Carol, will you share with us, please, 1 Corinthians 16:8?
But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost.
Right. So he says right there that he's in Ephesus as he writes the letter, as Nick pointed out earlier. So we know the setting. We know it's got to be after the year 51. And if we look at Acts chapters 18 and 19, you can kind of piece together his travel itinerary. He goes to Ephesus, Caesarea, Jerusalem, Galatia, Phrygia. Then he comes back to Ephesus, and that's when he stays parked in Ephesus for quite some time. We also know that there was another letter Paul wrote before this. Tom, would you share with us, please, 1 Corinthians 5:9?
I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons.
Right. So Paul is referring to a letter he has already written, which we do not have a copy of. So 1 Corinthians is really only first as compared to the other letter we have, 2 Corinthians. This is definitely not the first letter between Paul and the Corinthian church. And we know that there are letters that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. He refers to them right here. And so we just want to bear that in mind. This is one piece of a larger correspondence. We are reading other people's mail, but we don't have all the letters. And in a sense, it's like overhearing someone talk on the phone. We're kind of piecing together what the Corinthians were saying based on Paul's response to it, or he's saying, well, you just said whatever. So in piecing it together, we got to remember we're seeing one side of the story. Thankfully for us, it is Paul's side, because Paul is a really insightful preacher and theologian. So it is good that we have his take on all this. Other questions? Tremendous. So the other thing I want to touch on in terms of an introduction is some scholars have tried to make the case that 1 Corinthians is a composite, that this is actually a couple of different letters, and at some point, some faithful person said, you know what, I'm just going to put these together into a single document. None of the people who advance this theory agree with each other on where those breaks would be. None of them can point to a spot and say, well, here it kind of looks like he makes a leap from one thing to another and there's no rhyme or reason to it. You know, maybe that is the sign that they had pasted two letters together. The two major proponents of this theory, Johannes Weiss and Walter Schmithels, all of your good old-time German Bible scholars, they did not agree with each other, and they did not agree with themselves from time to time. They kept revising, well, actually, I think the breaks are here, and so on, so on, so on. So it seems like nobody can actually pull any good textual evidence to say, yeah, this is a composite letter. There's no manuscript evidence that says First Corinthians is missing. You know, that there's no copy we have of First Corinthians where 4 chapters are gone out of the middle of it, which might indicate, hey, at some point these 4 chapters weren't here. Somebody inserted them later. We have never found any manuscripts like that. There is a manuscript of First Corinthians that they dated to the year 200. So Paul wrote it approximately the year 50. So this is not that long after Paul wrote it. It's missing 3 verses out of the whole letter. It is not missing chapters or major sections. This is actually 2 centuries older than the oldest gospel manuscript that has been found so far. So our manuscript evidence of First Corinthians is remarkably good and remarkably consistent. Why does it matter that it does not seem to be a composite letter? That tells us we can look for themes that should carry through the whole letter. That tells us that it reflects Paul's thinking on a situation in a relatively narrow amount of time. So it's kind of a snapshot. It's rather than Romans is maybe more of a retrospective. He's looking back and kind of trying to hit the highlights of his theology. This is very much a snapshot. So there is a unity to it, and finding that thread that kind of pulls it all together was kind of challenging for me as I put the study together. As I mentioned to some folks earlier, in 12 years of preparing Bible studies, this one was definitely the most challenging so far. But I think it will be worth it, and we will figure out whether it was worth it over the next couple of weeks. So let me stop there. Questions, comments, concerns, insights. Keeping in mind that we still have several more weeks of this. Likely many questions will get answered in those coming weeks, but what is on people's hearts right now?
I'm curious, those 3 verses that were missing from that manuscript, I mean, where'd they come from then? Or, you know, if that was supposedly the complete, and I looked at some of the verses, there's nothing really outstanding about them. Like the first one, for example, chapter 9, verse 3, this is my defense to those who would examine me. I mean, it's kind of like a connector that maybe somebody thought was needed.
It wouldn't be like a manuscript of John's gospel that's missing chapter 3, verse 16. That would be a significant omission. So yeah, where did those verses come from? Well, they came from other copies of this that we have. One of the great things about the New Testament is that the Christians made lots of copies of their books. So we have lots of manuscripts of these things. And there's a lot of different ways that the manuscripts start to diverge from one another. The first is someone just made a mistake. They were in the middle of doing this and they just skipped a line, or because the verse numbers didn't come in until much later. Verse numbers came in closer to Luther's time. So somebody might have just skipped a sentence. Somebody might have just skipped a line. Mistakes happen. This is all being done by hand. Some of the variants might come in. One of the practices is one person would read a copy of a document and several people would be writing it down. So they're kind of dictated so they can make more than one copy at once. And it may have been that the guy said one word and someone heard something else, or it's one of those words where, there or there. Or am I referring to something that belongs to a group of other people, or am I saying it's over there as opposed to over here? So that sort of thing happens as well. Something else that seems to have happened is scribes would sometimes annotate the texts. They would sometimes write in the margins little notes to themselves, or maybe even notes to help whoever read it next, just to explain something. The next person who copied it might have thought that that was supposed to be part of the text. It might have been just absorbed that way. And obviously there's, physical documents get damaged. There's all sorts of different ways that these things can devolve, but there's also all sorts of interesting ways that scholars have of assessing what gets us closest to what we think is the original version. And if you ever look at a Greek New Testament, at the bottom you'll see a bunch of stuff at the bottom, but one of the things you'll see at the bottom is there will be a note for various verses, and it'll be followed by a letter, A through E. And A means when there is difference between different versions that they have. When it's marked A, it means we're as certain as we can be that this is the actual, correct reading of it, down through E, which is, we have no idea. We just decided to go with this for whatever reason. But so they're graded using a bunch of different scholarly criteria.
Actually, my thought is I have looked through the work of many very fine and skilled transcriptionists and noted quite a few mistakes just on the first time around. I think when you see so few changes and so much consistency over these centuries, it is almost miraculous, and almost the only way I can see where it could be so consistent is by the hand of God.
Yeah, and I think part of it has to do with the Holy Spirit is at work in these people, and I think these people understand the importance of what they're doing. They're not just copying someone's grocery list. Like, this is something that has the potential to change lives. And I think that is a piece of it as well. The other thing I'll throw out there is there are certain documents from antiquity that we know of only from a single manuscript. And I'll do a little ranting and raving here that, when I got to seminary, people would be going, well, how could we possibly only have one copy of this letter from such and such to such and such? What do you mean there's only one copy? I'm going, this was written on plant fibers 2,500 years ago. This was not inscribed in stone. This was written with, like soot on plant fibers 500 years before Jesus. The fact that we have anything at all is miraculous. The fact that we have anything is amazing. And certainly with letters, why would you make multiple copies? I want to send Tom a letter. I'm not going to make a dozen copies of the letter and distribute them to a bunch of other people. No, I'm going to make one copy and I'm going to send it to Tom, because not a lot of people can read and write. So if I have to hire somebody to write a letter, I'm not going to pay to get a bunch of copies made. So there. And don't get me started on the people wearing pajama pants like they're regular pants. I don't have the energy for that tonight.
Where does that come from?
That's just my default thing I like to complain about. I try to find the
I got to
thing that
chime
makes
in
me.
with the pastor on that one too.
I kind of agree, but where did that come from, this whole thing?
No, it's
Okay.
just my thing I like to complain about. Makes me sound most like an old man. That's
That and
right.
the girls that are wearing slippers in the high school. I don't get it.
That's right. And tell them to keep their skateboards off the sidewalks.
And I love the torn jeans.
I know, you're paying for clothes that you don't even have half of it.
You're right.
And if we were in Corinth, our disagreements over what kind of pants were acceptable would probably be tearing the church apart.
It would. Yes.
That's funny.
So, but that is what I have for you tonight. Hopefully we have set the stage for a very fruitful study going forward. And yeah, we will be back here again next week, and we will be spending quite a bit more time in our Bibles, but I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork tonight. So any final thoughts or reflections on this? All right. Well, why don't we close our time tonight praying the Lord's Prayer together?
Okay.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank
You are
Pastor.
very welcome. It is good to be back with you on Wednesday evening, and we will see everybody again soon.
Thank you. Good
You are
night.
very welcome. Blessings on your evening.
God bless everyone. Bye-bye.